The world remembers him by a single name, Dracula, but before he became a monster of myth, before he was reborn in the pages of Bram Stoker's novel, he was a man of flesh and blood, a man whose cruelty was so extreme, whose imagination for terror was so twisted, that he has gone down in history as one of the most brutal rulers of all time. To his enemies, he was the devil himself. To his people, he was both a savior and a tyrant. And to us, centuries later, he is remembered as something beyond human, the figure who inspired the vampire legend, the eternal lord of darkness. This is the story of Vlad III of Wallachia, Vlad the Impaler, Vlad Dracula, a prince forged in betrayal, raised in chains, who rose to power through rivers of blood and mountains of corpses. Tonight, we enter his world, a world of fire, steel, and sharpened stakes. A world where death itself bowed to the will of Dracula. Vlad was born in 1431 in the Transylvanian town of Sighisoara. His father, Vlad II, was no ordinary noble. He was a member of the Order of the Dragon, a brotherhood of Christian knights sworn to defend Europe against the Muslim Ottomans. The dragon symbol became his crest, his identity. It was from this title, Dracul, meaning the dragon, that his son would gain his infamous name, Dracula, the son of the dragon. But while the dragon suggested honor, fire, and courage, Vlad's early years were shaped not by triumph but by treachery. Wallachia, the land his father ruled, was a kingdom caught between giants. To the west was Hungary, a powerful Christian kingdom. To the east, the mighty Ottoman Empire, whose armies stretched across the Balkans and threatened Europe itself. The Wallachian throne was a dangerous seat. Princes were overthrown, murdered, betrayed in endless cycles of blood. In 1442, when Vlad was just 11 years old, his father made a decision that would scar his son forever. To secure his position and prove his loyalty to the Ottomans, Vlad II handed over two of his sons, Vlad and his younger brother Radu, as hostages to Sultan Murad II. Imagine it, a boy of 11 torn from his family, his home, and sent into the heart of the enemy's empire. At the Ottoman court, Vlad and Radu were treated with both privilege and menace. They were educated in philosophy, science, languages, horsemanship, archery, and the art of war, but they were also prisoners, constantly reminded that their lives depended on their father's obedience. Displease the Sultan? The boys could be blinded, or executed. For years Vlad lived under the shadow of fear. He saw the Janissaries, elite Ottoman soldiers, once Christian boys stolen from their families, now converted into ruthless warriors, trained in cruelty and absolute obedience. His younger brother Radu adapted easily. Handsome, charming, he gained favor with the Sultan. He converted to Islam, enjoyed the luxuries of court life, and would later earn the name Radu Selfrumos, Radu the Handsome. But Vlad was different. Where Radu yielded, Vlad hardened. Where Radu smiled, Vlad seethed. He studied the Ottomans not to join them, but to understand their methods, their strategies, their discipline, their brutality. He saw how fear controlled armies, how cruelty broke men's spirits, and deep within his heart, resentment boiled. Years of captivity twisted him. Whether he was beaten, humiliated, or forced to witness unspeakable punishments, we cannot know. But what we do know is that when Vlad returned to Wallachia, he carried with him not only knowledge, but rage, a rage that would soon consume his enemies. In 1447, when Vlad was 16, tragedy struck. His father, Vlad II, who had sworn oaths to both Hungary and the Ottomans, was caught in a deadly game of politics. The Hungarian king grew suspicious. The Wallachian boyars, the noble elite, betrayed their prince. Vlad II was ambushed, captured, and murdered. His eldest son, Mircea, suffered a fate so cruel it could only breed vengeance. He was blinded with hot iron stakes and then buried alive. When the young Vlad heard the news, still a hostage in foreign hands, something inside him broke. His family destroyed, his father betrayed by the very nobles who had sworn loyalty, his brother tortured to death in the dirt. It was more than politics. It was personal. It was blood for blood. That same year, a rival was installed on the Wallachian throne. Vlad, meanwhile, was released by the Ottomans, who hoped he might serve their purposes. In 1448, at just 17 years old, he briefly seized power in Wallachia, but he was too young, too inexperienced, too isolated. Within months, Hungarian-backed rivals overthrew him. Vlad fled into exile. But exile did not weaken him. It sharpened him. He wandered from Moldavia to Transylvania, learning, waiting, plotting. He studied fortifications. He built alliances. He nourished his hatred like a flame. For years he lived as a prince without a throne. But in 1456, an opportunity arose. Hungary, at war with the Ottomans, supported his claim to Wallachia. With their backing, Vlad marched on his homeland and seized the throne once more. But this was not the same boy who had left. This was not a prisoner. This was Dracula reborn, and this time, he would not rule with kindness or trust. He had learned that trust meant betrayal, and mercy meant death. So he turned to the one weapon that could never fail him: terror. The boyars of Wallachia had murdered his father. They had destroyed his brother. They had divided and weakened the land. Vlad would never forgive them. In 1457, on Easter Sunday, he invited the boyars to a grand feast at his court in Târgoviște. Nobles, their wives, their children, the whole elite gathered, dressed in their finest robes, feasting and drinking, thinking themselves honored guests. But Vlad had other plans. At the height of the celebration, Vlad's soldiers stormed the hall. The guests were seized, bound in chains. Confusion turned to horror as Vlad accused them of treason, of betraying his father, of causing Wallachia's endless misery. There would be no mercy. The elderly nobles, too frail to work, were executed immediately. Many were dragged screaming into the courtyard and impaled on sharpened stakes, their bodies left to writhe in agony as their families watched. The younger nobles were forced on a death march to the mountains. There, at the foot of the cliffs, they were worked to exhaustion building Vlad's fortress at Poinari. Most never survived. Their wives and children were not spared. Many were killed outright. Others were enslaved. The massacre shocked Wallachia. Hundreds of years of boyar power had been broken in a single night. Vlad had torn the heart out of the nobility and replaced it with fear, and this was only the beginning. Vlad had discovered his true power, terror as a weapon of control. Impalement became his signature, his obsession, his art. The method was grotesque. Victims were stripped naked, bound, and lowered onto a sharpened stake which was forced into the body through the rectum, vagina, or abdomen. The stake was oiled to prolong suffering. It was carefully angled so it would avoid vital organs, ensuring the victim lingered in agony for hours, sometimes days. Once secured, the stake was raised upright and the victim's body was left hanging, twitching, as blood ran down the wood. It was not just an execution, it was a spectacle. Fields of impaled corpses lined the roads. Entire forests of the dead greeted travelers. The stench of rot filled the air. Birds circled above, feeding on the flesh. To Vlad it was more than punishment. It was a message: betray me, defy me, and this is your fate. The boyars who once defied him were gone. The people who once mocked him were silenced. Fear ruled Wallachia now, and fear had a name: Dracula. By the year 1459, Vlad Dracula had transformed from a boy scarred by betrayal into a ruler feared by all who crossed him. But one enemy loomed above all others: the Ottoman Empire. To the south lay Mehmed II, known as Mehmed the Conqueror, the most powerful man of his age. At just 21 years old, he had accomplished what no other ruler had managed in 1,000 years. He had captured Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, and renamed it Istanbul. Mehmed's armies were vast, professional, disciplined, and terrifying. Tens of thousands of janissaries, elite slave soldiers taken as boys from Christian families, trained to kill without mercy, war elephants from Asia, cannons that could batter down the mightiest walls. Against such a colossus stood Wallachia, a small principality wedged between mountains and rivers, poor in resources, rich only in blood. But Vlad had no intention of bowing to the Sultan. For years Wallachian princes had paid tribute to the Ottomans: gold, supplies, even boys taken as slaves to fill the Sultan's armies. Mehmed expected Vlad to do the same, but Dracula had other plans. When Ottoman envoys arrived at his court demanding tribute, they refused to remove their turbans in his presence, claiming it was their custom to never bare their heads. Vlad smiled coldly. "Then you shall never remove them again," he declared. His soldiers hammered iron spikes through the turbans into the envoys' skulls, nailing the headdress permanently to their flesh. The men screamed in agony before collapsing to the ground, their blood soaking into the palace floor. This was no mere punishment, this was a declaration of war. From that moment forward, Dracula's name was burned into the memory of the Ottoman Empire. In 1462, the inevitable came. Furious at Vlad's defiance, Sultan Mehmed assembled one of the greatest armies Europe had ever seen: more than 100,000 soldiers, including 20,000 janissaries, cavalry, siege engineers, and supply caravans stretching for miles. Against them, Vlad could muster perhaps 20,000 Wallachians, farmers, peasants, a few hardened soldiers, brave, but hopelessly outnumbered. To face the Ottomans in open battle would be suicide, so Vlad chose another path. He unleashed a campaign of scorched earth. As the Ottoman army advanced, Wallachian villages were set ablaze, their wells poisoned, their fields stripped of crops. Behind every abandoned house, behind every smoldering barn, death awaited. Peasants were slaughtered rather than captured. Herds of animals were driven into ravines and burned. The land itself became a weapon, but Vlad was not content with destruction alone. He wanted terror. At night, his men disguised themselves in Ottoman uniforms and slipped into enemy camps. Guards were strangled in silence, tents set ablaze, horses driven into panic. Soldiers awoke to chaos, cutting down their own comrades in confusion. The most infamous of these came on the night of June 17, 1462. As the Ottoman army camped near Târgoviște, Vlad and a hand-picked force of perhaps 10,000 men crept through the darkness. Their target, the Sultan himself, with torches in hand and blades drawn, they charged into the camp. The night exploded in fire and blood. Horses screamed, men shouted in terror. Arrows rained down as Wallachian soldiers cut through tents, slaughtering all in their path. The Ottomans, confused and panicked, turned their weapons on each other. Some accounts claim Vlad reached within sight of Mehmed's own tent, cutting down the Sultan's guards before finally being forced to retreat. By dawn, thousands of Ottoman corpses lay sprawled across the camp. Though Mehmed survived, the message was clear. Wallachia would not fall quietly. It was not a victory in numbers, but it was a victory in fear. Mehmed himself, conqueror of Constantinople, had nearly fallen to the blade of Dracula. If the night attack was terrifying, what came next was pure nightmare. As Mehmed advanced deeper into Wallachia, expecting the prince to surrender, he instead found the most grotesque sight of his entire career. On the road to Târgoviște, the Sultan and his men encountered what chroniclers would later call the Forest of the Impaled. An estimated 20,000 corpses lined the road, men, women, even children, each mounted on sharpened wooden stakes. The smell was unbearable. The air buzzed with flies. Carrion birds circled overhead, tearing flesh from the dead. The arrangement was deliberate, rows upon rows, stretching across the landscape, forming a nightmarish tableau of agony. Some victims were impaled through the chest, others through the abdomen. Many were impaled through the rectum, the stake carefully angled to avoid vital organs so that the victim could linger alive for hours, even days. Some accounts claim the Ottomans saw mothers impaled with infants still clutched to their breasts. Entire villages displayed like grotesque trophies. The soldiers recoiled in horror. Hardened janissaries who had fought in countless battles were sickened at the sight. Even Sultan Mehmed himself, conqueror of Constantinople, was shaken. According to legend, he surveyed the field of death and muttered, "It is not possible to deprive of his country a man who has done such things, who has such a diabolical understanding of how to govern." The army pressed on, but the fear was planted. The Forest of the Impaled was not just an execution ground, it was a message written in blood and agony. To fight Dracula was to march into hell itself. Yet Vlad's cruelty was not reserved only for the Ottomans. His own people soon felt the sharp end of his stakes. Wallachia had long been plagued by corruption. Boyars plotted endlessly for power. Merchants cheated their customers. Thieves roamed the roads. To Vlad this was weakness, and weakness invited conquest, so he set out to cleanse his land. One famous story tells of a golden cup placed in the central square of Târgoviște. The cup was free for anyone to use to drink water, and yet under Vlad's reign, not a single person dared steal it. Why? Because punishment was swift, merciless, and always the same: impalement. Merchants who sold goods at unfair prices, impaled. Wives accused of adultery, impaled. Peasants who stole bread, impaled. There was no distinction between noble and commoner. To Dracula, guilt was guilt, and terror was justice. One tale tells of a woman who complained that her husband did not earn enough money to feed her. Vlad ordered the man executed for laziness, and the woman forced to remarry. Another account tells of visiting envoys who removed their hats in his presence. Vlad ordered their heads cut off instantly, claiming, "This is how Wallachians respect their prince." But perhaps the most chilling story is of the beggars of Târgoviște. According to legend, Vlad invited hundreds of beggars to a grand feast in a hall. They ate, drank, and laughed, thanking their generous prince. When the meal was finished, Vlad asked them, "Do you wish to be without care in this world?" The beggars, delighted, said yes. Vlad ordered the doors barred, and the hall set ablaze, burning them alive. To him, it was not cruelty, but cleansing. He claimed he had eliminated poverty in a single night. This was Dracula's justice, absolute, unrelenting, and drenched in blood. Yet it worked. Crime in Wallachia plummeted. Merchants traveled without fear. Roads once plagued by bandits became safe. For ordinary peasants, Vlad was both protector and monster. To live under Dracula was to live under a law stronger than steel, the law of fear. By the early 1460s, Vlad Dracula's reputation had spread across Europe. To the Christian kingdoms, he was sometimes praised as a defender of the faith. He had resisted the Ottomans, struck terror into the heart of Mehmed himself, and held the frontier against Islam. Even Pope Pius II praised him as a champion of Christendom. But the stories of his cruelty could not be ignored. Saxon merchants, furious at Vlad for punishing them with death when they defied his trade laws, began to spread pamphlets filled with lurid tales. They claimed Vlad impaled not just soldiers and criminals, but innocents, women, even children. These pamphlets spread across Germany, France, and beyond, some of the very first printed materials in Europe. Vlad was no longer just a local tyrant. He was becoming a legend of cruelty. In the Ottoman Empire, he was remembered as a demon, the man who created forests of the dead, the mad prince who laughed as thousands writhed on stakes. Even within his family, divisions tore him apart. His younger brother, Radu the Handsome, now fully loyal to the Ottomans, led armies against him. Brother fought brother, blood of the dragon against blood of the dragon. Vlad Dracula stood between worlds. To some he was a hero, to others a monster, to all he was unforgettable, and his reign of terror was only just beginning. Power is a precarious throne, particularly for a man who ruled by terror. Vlad had made enemies as quickly as he made order. The boyars he annihilated did not die quietly. Their surviving families nursed hatred that simmered across generations. Saxon merchants, cut off from privileges and punished for dishonesty, fanned the flames of rumor across Europe. His younger brother Radu, handsome, fluent in courtly manners and favored by the Ottomans, sat like a living mirror of what Vlad might have been had he chosen compromise over cruelty. Where Vlad used stakes and spectacle, Radu used smiles and strategic submission. By 1462, those enemies moved like wolves in the dark. Sultan Mehmed II, stung and shamed by the night attack and haunted by the forest of the Impaled, was determined to remove the man who had turned humiliation into a weapon. He found in Radu and in disaffected Wallachian boyars a coalition of convenience. Radu, riding pinned honors and Ottoman support, marched north with a force of Turks and Wallachian defectors. Mehmed finally believed he had found a route for the thorn in his side. Vlad fought with the ferocity of a cornered king. He struck like lightning, harrying supply lines, cutting the legs from pursuing forces with ambushes and scorched earth tactics. But the balance of politics tilted beneath him. Wealthy merchants, wary nobles, and foreign kings did not wish to be associated with a prince who had turned law into terror. Alliances frayed. Even Vlad's once feared name became liability. When Vlad fled, it was not in the panicked confusion of a beaten soldier but in the bitter, measured exile of a man who had read his fate in every spike and every corpse. He sought allies north, in the court of Matthias Corvinus, the king of Hungary, who had his own reasons to both fear and use Vlad. Matthias needed a buffer against the Ottomans and a harsh enforcer against the disorder along his borders, but he also needed legitimacy and favor with merchants and the papacy. Vlad's fame, woven from fact and terrifying rumor, was a double-edged sword. Legend complicates the record. Some say Matthias welcomed Vlad as a useful scourge, and then quietly imprisoned him when the diplomatic cost rose too high. Others say Vlad was betrayed by those he trusted. What we do know is brutally simple. Vlad was taken from power and placed in captivity. A prince whose hands had once been stained with thousands of lives, now bound in chains and led away by foreign guards. Betrayal was the currency of the age, and Vlad now had to pay his own dues. Prisons do strange things to men used to power. They strip them to the core. They sharpen obsessions into madness. For Vlad, the years of detention, variously described as house arrest in relative comfort or as bleak dungeon confinement, hardened the legend as much as the man. Accounts differ. Hungarian chronicles suggest that Matthias kept Vlad under control precisely because he feared his volatility. Others imply that the king was repulsed by rumors and the ire of trading guilds. What matters more for our story than the exact stone walls is what Vlad became inside them, a living ghost of his former self, with time to brood and to turn his cruelty inward or outward, depending on the storyteller's taste. Prison rumors thrive because they are vivid. One of the most chilling tales told by contemporaries and later pamphleteers alike is that Vlad, in captivity, amused himself by torturing animals, mutilating birds, impaling small beasts, or experimenting with pain as if the cruelty were natural to his hand. Whether true or an inflamed attempt to paint a monster, these stories served a purpose. They justified the fear he inspired and fed the appetite of readers hungry for horror. But captivity did not erase calculation. Jesus of Nazareth himself would not have pleased all sides of the medieval court. Matthias, navigating between papal pressure, merchant unrest, and Ottoman diplomacy, eventually decided that Vlad might yet serve a purpose. The geopolitical chessboard had shifted, the Ottomans continued to press the Christian front, and a man like Vlad, feared, ruthless, unburdened by sentiment, might once more be useful as a frontier bulwark. So, after roughly a decade and a half, the prisoner was freed. Vlad's return to active politics was not the triumphant march of a paragon come home. It was a measured, violent reclamation. He married, again securing a fragile legitimacy through alliances with Hungary. He gathered men, not just outcasts but hardened fighters who knew their leader's reputation, and feared his ruthlessness as much as they respected his ability to hold ground against foreign foes. The autumn of Vlad's life is a blur of skirmishes and betrayals that reads like the closing scene of a tragedy. In 1476, pushing to retake full control, Vlad launched operations against Ottoman incursions and rival claimants. This short second reign was a final, bloody attempt to impose his design on a restless land. It would end not with a coronation but with a death as sudden and savage as his methods. Accounts of the final battle are fragmentary and often contradictory. Some chronicles claim that Vlad was betrayed by Wallachian boyars who had learned to wear two faces, to smile and to stab at the proper moment. Others say he was cut down while leading a charge against Ottoman forces. Still others propose a darker twist, that in the confusion and chaos of night, fighting men could not identify their prince. Friendly troops might have mistaken him for a foe. Whatever the immediate cause, the outcome was stark. Vlad was killed in combat. Some versions say he died on the field surrounded by the men who had never learned mercy. Ottoman sources, always bent to the triumph of the Sultan, insist that his head was taken as proof to Istanbul. A head, they say, salted or preserved by methods common to the time, was delivered to Sultan Mehmed II, the man he had humiliated and who now reclaimed the final trophy. For Mehmed and his generals, the spectacle of the man who had once decorated roads with human trophies now displayed as a trophy himself was a gory symmetry they savored. For Wallachia, the removal of Dracula was a fracture worthy of a sorrowed and relieved populace. Relief for those who had suffered under his terror, mourning for those who saw him as a stern protector, and confusion for a land that had been governed by the sharpest of ironies. The fate of Vlad's remains has become the fertile ground of myth. Some tradition places his burial at Snagov Monastery, an island in a dark, still lake outside Bucharest. Archaeological investigations have been inconclusive. Bone fragments found at the site have been variously interpreted. Animal bones, disturbed graves, or remnants of a genuine burial. Other whispers say that his body was never afforded a proper interment but rather hidden or disposed of by those who feared the lingering power of his legend. The ambiguity only enhanced the myth. The missing corpse is part of the monster's immortality. Death, in Vlad's case, did what death does best to the notorious. It freed the story from the constraints of direct observation and let rumor breathe. Those rumors found a convenient vehicle in the infancy of European print culture. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, German and Saxon merchants and chroniclers, who had economic and personal grudges against Vlad, began printing pamphlets and broadside accounts that recited his crimes in lurid detail. These handbills, intended as scandal and as proof that trade with Wallachia was dangerous, did not merely report news, they invented spectacles. Woodcut illustrations showed forests of stakes, monstrous countenances and scenes of debauched court life. Texts circulated exaggerated numbers, 20,000, 30,000, and described acts so extreme that even medieval readers paused. Whether merchants exaggerated to justify boycotts, whether political enemies inflated the gore to tarnish a rival, these printed diatribes succeeded in turning a regional ruler into a European bogeyman. These accounts mixed fact with fiction. They took Vlad's core reality, that he used impalement and terror, and stretched it until the man and the myth became indistinguishable. A man who had employed brutality as governance was transformed into a caricature of pure sadism. That caricature fed the imagination of the Renaissance and early modern Europe, a society eager for tales of barbarism from the eastern frontiers. Parallel to the printed slanders ran another current, local folk belief. In the lands of Wallachia and Transylvania, whisperings about the restless dead, Strigoi, Moroi, and other revenant spirits had long circulated among peasants. These were not the polished vampires of Victorian fiction, but rather revenants, restless souls who returned to torment the living, poison crops, or drain vitality. They could be witches, unbaptized infants, or the improperly buried. These folk motifs lent a supernatural color to Vlad's posthumous reputation. Where printed pamphlets gave him monstrous acts, folklore gave him monstrous endurance. If villagers longed to give shape to fear, they could do so by imagining that Dracula's cruelty extended past death. Why bury a tyrant? Why allow his restless spirit to walk? Such questions were the crumbly mortar that joined the man to the myth of the undead. And so, over the centuries, two streams flowed together, the pamphleteer's gory strokes and the villagers' whispering ghosts. Together they produced a figure that could not be dismissed as mere historical oddity. Dracula was being born, not merely a prince who impaled but a revenant who might rise again. Fast forward to the 19th century, Europe's fascination with the exotic East, its appetite for Gothic horror, and the rise of scholarly interest in Central and Eastern Europe created the perfect environment for Vlad's final metamorphosis. Travelogues and ethnographies began to circulate in English. Historians and dilettantes translated those old pamphlets and folk accounts. Travelers' tales about Transylvania's misty forests, its superstitions, and its stone monasteries captured the Victorian imagination. An Irish novelist named Bram Stoker read these accounts. He avidly compiled notes from travel guides, newspapers, and the early academic histories of Wallachia and Transylvania. Among his sources were printed histories and travel narratives that mentioned Vlad as Dracula, the son of Dracula, or that catalogued the macabre pamphlets that had circulated in Germany. Stoker did not construct his vampire from a single biography of Vlad, but he found in the mixture of name, place, and sensational rumor the raw material for a count who was both noble and monstrous. In 1897, Dracula arrived in bookstores as a novel of creeping dread. Stoker's Count was an elegant predatory aristocrat who moved between crumbling castles and modern London, feeding in the night and defying Christian symbols. Stoker painted the vampire with many colors stolen from the older sources. The foreignness of the East, the image of the nobleman with archaic power, and the aura of blood-soaked violence. He gave the Count a name that carried centuries of dread. He supplied the modern template, the vampire as both aristocrat and predator. From that moment, Vlad's name, whether he liked it or not, became conflated with the fictional undead. The historical correlation was thin at best. Stoker's creature drinks blood, sleeps in a coffin, and can be staked to death, traits drawn more from pan-European folklore than from any documentation of Vlad's life. But the name Dracula stuck. The real man's identity and the book's fictional monster fused in the public mind. Once Stoker cast his shadow, the world of art and film did the rest. From silent films to the talkies, from Bela Lugosi's sepulchral charm to Christopher Lee's towering presence, Dracula became the screen's favorite aristocrat. Every iteration drained something else from the historical Vlad and added modern anxieties, sexuality, contagion, the fear of the foreign aristocrat preying on modern innocence. Meanwhile, in Romania itself, opinions turned complex and political. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Romanian nationalists began to reclaim Vlad as a fierce defender of the land, a symbol of resistance against Ottoman encroachment. Where Western pamphlets had demonized him, Romanian historians sometimes rehabilitated him, stressing his defense of Wallachia and his efforts to maintain order. Monuments were raised, and the image of Dracula was retooled as a kind of cultural capital. Snagov and Poinari later became pilgrimage sites of a grim sort, visited by those who wanted to stand where terror once ruled. At the same time, global pop culture embraced and cheapened the legend in equal measure. Dracula-themed tourism, commercialized castle tours, and horror franchises turned the very idea of Vlad into commodified fear. Yet in midnight cinemas and in quiet museum halls, the echo of the real man, the prince who impaled, who resisted empire, who died with the weight of his own legend pressing on his bones, remains audible. Vlad's life closed in the muddy silence of a battlefield and in the proud, indifferent gaze of a sultan who displayed his head as proof. His body likely returned to the earth in a place we cannot now verify, yet his true burial never happened. It would not, and could not. The printing press, oral tradition, travel writing, Victorian fiction, and modern cinema together kept Vlad alive, transmuted into a being who could never truly die. He is many things at once: a defender and a destroyer, a patriot and a psychopath, a medieval prince whose actions were as political as they were personal. In the end, the most terrible thing about Vlad may be how human he was. Furious, hurt by betrayal, driven to extreme measures because he believed the alternative was the annihilation of his realm. Vlad Dracula found his immortality, not as a historian's neat footnote, but as a dark legend whose teeth never dull, whose shadow never fades.